Welcome to the Retro 21 Studios podcast. I'm your host, M Squared. Please support the podcast by clicking on the like and subscribe buttons on our various podcast channels, such as Podbean, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. We are working on distribution to other channels as well. I also ask for your generous support in helping to expand the podcast. Due to increasing interest in the podcast, I am positively inundated with requests for interviews, on-site requests, and backlog of shows in post-production. Thus far, Retro 21 has provided our audience interviews focused on AI with experts in agriculture, medicine, religion, the world of sports, engineering, and science. Our upcoming episodes are part of a series that explore the topic of responsible AI and algorithmic bias, which include interviews with a criminologist and 2 statisticians. We also have a lineup of guests featured in our brand storytelling episodes, which includes an interview with Kurt Schrader, the CEO and co-founder of Shortcut, a technology company that created an innovative solution for project management and issue tracking platform. And we have a follow-up episode with Ralph Boudwin, Toy Cook, Victor Hudson, and the amazing team and their partners working on advanced sensor technology at Game Changer Analytics. Each of our guests provide their timely, broad perspectives and experiences in the rapidly expanding world of artificial intelligence. To support our efforts, please visit the Retro 21 Studios website at www.retro21studios.com and click on support. For those interested in a sponsorship package or advisory services in digital transformation, which includes AI and tech strategy, please visit the Retro 21 Studio site and click on sponsorship. The site also contains an embedded list of current podcasts that can be viewed on the site. If you are interested in being interviewed for a podcast, please contact admin at retro21studios.com. Thank you for watching the Retro 21 Studios podcast, and I look forward to bringing you more of our talented guests on future episodes. Thank you for your support. This is M Squared. Take care. Welcome to the Retro 21 Studios podcast. I'm your host, M Squared. Today, I'm joined with Danielle Wallace. Danielle is an associate professor out of Arizona State University. Welcome, Danielle.
Hi, good morning.
How are you today?
I'm good. I'm excited to be here.
Awesome. The podcast is around the broad scope and spectrum of artificial intelligence. And today, I'd like to talk with you about criminology, and in particular about algorithmic bias. I came across a few articles that talked about the use of AI, and I didn't realize that AI has been used in a criminal justice context for quite a few years, in particular around sentencing, and it raised some concerns. There were some biases there, so I'm hoping to gain your insights from a criminal justice perspective.
Sure, absolutely. Is difficult in that issues of criminal justice and recidivism, sentencing, and even policing, where we've seen AI get used, they're really complex social problems that have a lot of different angles. And the concern is that AI can create bias, particularly racial bias, and the outcomes that it's focusing on, but also not necessarily capture all of the complex social issues that play a role in shaping things like sentencing, recidivism, re-entry processes, and police decision making.
So how is that happening? So there's bias in AI, or is it how AI is structured? I guess fundamentally AI is working off of some sort of language model in this particular case.
AI is, like you said, structured off of natural language processing, and a lot of AI processes need to be trained in some way. If the AI is getting trained to detect something like the potential for recidivism, which you are particularly interested in for this podcast, if the information being put into the AI system or training the AI system is biased itself, then it's going to produce a biased result.
Mm-hmm.
AI is ultimately a function of human processes that feeds the AI information. I would be remiss to say that AI itself is racially biased, but rather that the processes that lead into AI, that the information and the data that feeds AI, and then those AI processes that are then implemented to, say, come up with a recidivism risk or predictive policing on where to focus police resources, that information that feeds those AI models might have bias within it. And there's a ton of different ways in which bias can be fed into data and things like that.
That's an interesting point. And just to be clear, what you're saying is that so these models are deriving their information from the internet or other models, but it's not necessarily intentional. When we say data is being fed into there, it's okay, let me find all this biased data, push it into the system. It's already in those large corpuses of
Right.
information.
Yeah. You think about the issue of recidivism, right? We know that people of color are overpoliced. They have sentencing disparities, face more punitive outcomes in court and in police interactions and in incarceration spaces. And all of the data regarding who they are and the crimes they've committed and the police contact that they have comes from these criminal justice systems that we have embedded stereotypes and racism in the bulk of these systems. If recidivism data and recidivism risk data is coming from a system that doesn't necessarily focus on, say, cultural differences between various races and ethnicities or deep social understandings, or more importantly, gathering data to help us understand these contexts, and then that gets fed into some AI process that generates a risk model, then they're just going to carry that forward into the AI process. That's when you have to be very careful when using AI. This isn't to say that AI is bad at all. It's a really interesting, phenomenal tool that might expedite human labor to some extent, right? It's difficult to ascertain if somebody is at risk for recidivism. So let's see if we can have a computer program help us with that. But in order for that to be done really successfully, we need to give it a lot of good, non-biased information to not have the outcome be biased.
And so there was I guess the system, if we could drill down, I think it was called Compass.
It looks like it was used by judges, probation and parole officers. And this was, let's see, it's the Correctional Officer Management Profiling Tool for Alternative Sanctions. It's run by a company called North Point. And it seems as if this was used in the Florida court system. I pulled up the Compass instrument. And I was looking at some of the elements that goes into the Compass instrument. And a lot of them make sense. I was actually surprised by all of the various things that go into them. And again, the Compass instrument itself might not necessarily be the problem. It might be the interpretation of the instrument. It might be the use of the instrument. But it includes things like criminal history, education and employment statuses. What's the highest level of education the person has had? What's their current employment status? What's their work history? They've got measures on substance abuse and drug and alcohol use. Some social relationship measures. Are you married? Are you in a stable relationship with a significant other? Are you cohabitating, or do you have a partner? And then if you have a stable or unstable familial situation, and then the nature of your peer relationships, and whether you have pro-social support, like a family member that can come in and provide you transportation, or is willing to listen to you and provide emotional support. And then you have things like the cognitions domain, and violence assessment risks. And then finally, there's a responsivity domain, which is issues like, are you going to be responsive to treatment?
Mm-hmm.
If we give you resources, will you use them effectively? And that includes low intelligence, whether they have a physical handicap,
Mm-hmm.
reading and writing limitations, mental health issues, not wanting to change or not wanting to participate in programs, homelessness, transportation, childcare limitations, language limitations,
Wow.
ethnic or cultural barriers. My suspicion here is that this is a function of, is the culture you're from receptive to, say, obtaining therapy or something like that?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
A history of abuse or neglect, or anxiety. So a lot of these things kind of point to some of the additional factors relating to recidivism that often isn't taken into account. So the Compass scale does have a very complex number of things going into it to help predict whether or not somebody's at risk for recidivism. But how those things get interpreted in Florida and whatnot is, it might be the complication in how effective Compass is being used at predicting risk.
How do they gain this data?
From my understanding of this, and I could very well be wrong, it looks like when somebody first comes in contact with the police and might be getting booked in jail for sentencing or something along those lines, they take the self-reported survey for
Mm-hmm.
Compass. And this gives them information on potentially what their risk might be.
Mm-hmm.
And this probably gets fed into a data, gets entered of some data in some sort, and then a tool, an app of some kind probably produces a risk score given what the data enters.
So from a criminologist perspective, you described all of those criteria.
Yeah.
What does that mean to you?
So I look at the Compass scale and I was happy that it had as much as it did. I've done some work in recidivism, and recidivism is just deeply complex, right? Being in prison puts somebody out of social life. It changes their relationships with their family, their spouse, their children, their partner, their friends. It changes their relationship and their ability to gain employment. It changes their relationship with their community. And as a society, when people exit, we often assume that now they're out of prison, all of these things are available to them. But there's this kind of transitionary period where they have to regain all of those things or re-establish those relationships. It's difficult. There's plenty of research that shows that, for example, female spouses of men who are incarcerated, and I believe this is Megan Comfort that showed this in her work, that, if the woman they're providing like 30% of their income to the incarceration fees and transportation needs to get to see their partner in prison. And it's really intensive. So they come out, it's hard to establish those relationships. They're not the same, right? You have somebody that's been out of prison holding the relationship, the family, the children, and stuff like that have been taking care of everything while the person's off to the side. It's not easy. And we don't give a lot of credence or support to people in reestablishing these relationships. The need to find housing, the need to find employment. Our society does not necessarily. We've got the box to check. Have you ever been a felon previously? It's just excessively difficult. And the going number right now is that 70% of people that exit prison go back in 3 years. And it's not surprising to me that they do. This doesn't necessarily mean that they're more criminogenic. It just means it's hard. And they might have committed a new crime. This isn't to say that they're blameless per se, but we've got to look at both sides of the coin. So thinking about everything that Compass put in there, I'm appreciative that it's a pretty large scale. But even in my own work, I've looked at issues of, say, health in prison, disability, chronic disease, relationships with your parole officer, the type of community you exit prison and enter into. All of those have effects on recidivism.
Right.
It is far broader than what's in the Compass scale. So I'm not surprised that there's a disjuncture between a predictive risk assessment and their real risk, because recidivism is far more complex than a 30-item scale. And I don't know if it's precisely 30 items, but it's got a lot. So it's more complex than that. It's really difficult to drum this down to these simplistic measures.
And is it the real fix? As you walk through this, I'm thinking about you're talking about the state of the community that they're in, where are these people going back to, and any number of factors. In the Compass system, while it brings in all this criteria, it manifests in a sentencing decision. And I imagine if the factors appear adverse, then they're just going to give you more time. So that doesn't necessarily fix the problem. And it sounds like, or feels like, there's some inherent unfairness.
Might make it worse, right?
Yeah, exactly.
It might make it worse because you're removing people from the community in which they need to be. You're removing them for longer amounts of time. The longer you're in prison, the harder it is to re-enter. Just think about being in prison in, say, the past 5 years. Imagine being sentenced for the past 5 years and you exit today. 5 years ago, technology was really different. So things have really changed. And I just don't think we understand how fast our society is moving right now with technological innovations and things like that, and how much people miss when they're in prison.
Wow.
And to say nothing of what that means for workability, like the ability to be employed. We think about it from the perspective of, maybe not as the same perspective, but it's a similar perspective. When mothers leave the workforce to have a child and to take care of the child and then enter the workforce a few years later, 10 years, whatever, many years later it is, if it's a substantial amount of time, that woman's skills have changed. They become irrelevant potentially. Same with older adults, right? If an older adult retires, their skills that they would have kept active on the job have declined in applicability to current day jobs. 5 years into retirement, they need a job. They're not going to be able to get hired for the same type of position they were in.
Right.
Same for prisoners when they exit. So I just don't think we're kind and thoughtful about those types of things. And the Compass scales don't incorporate a lot of those types of estimates.
That's interesting because we're going back to 2019, and I think quite a few jurisdictions, at least in Florida, are still using the tool.
Right. And even just when the tool was made, those items in the tool could have been really relevant. But as research progresses forward, as society progresses forward, those types of tools need to be constantly reevaluated and updated for societal changes and changes to the situation.